Thank you very much, George. As you might imagine, and if you've had any experience with these types of transboundary issues related to river basins, the problem of data, access to data, is very troubling. And in most cases, you can have access maybe to information in one country, but not in the other basin countries. And so through the use of the satellite information, we were trying to remove that issue, especially in this part of the world, because most people don't agree on the data which one country is saying, these are the numbers we have, the other country is saying, well, no, we don't agree to that. And so if you can use the satellite data, sometimes you can eliminate this problem. The difficulty that you run into there is the scale problem that George was talking about. You have 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer images of the land use pattern. Well, that's not very detailed if you want to know what's going on, say, a few hectares of land or something like this. So you have all of these problems, and that comes down to what George Box, a famous statistician, has said, which is basically that all models are wrong because we don't have the right data, we don't always know the right equations, but they're useful in many cases because they can help us to see the relative difference between one particular solution and another one. Maybe not the absolute difference, but the relative difference. And so then you can go on to say, well, yes, but how wrong do they have to be before they're not useful? So this is one of the problems that we have to deal with. George talked about the MODIS data, which gives us the land cover, the land use data. We also used what's called TRIM, which is a rainfall measurement mission, also launched by NASA. And it gives us, every 3 hours, it gives us a picture of the precipitation over the entire globe. So we're able then to have an estimate of evapotranspiration and an estimate of precipitation from which we can calculate the soil moisture balance, which is very important if you want to know the runoff. So we compared the satellite data to the available station data that we had, and we saw that, well, it looks pretty good. It obviously misses some of the peaks, and that's typical of the satellite data versus the station data. Station data tends to be on the order of 5 minutes duration as opposed to maybe 3 hours for the TRIM data. So you're missing some larger storm peaks and things like this. One thing we don't see here is a large amount of bias, which is very nice. So the satellite data tracks the ground data fairly well. So we talked quite a bit about the technical details of the modeling that we did to see how the conventions might suggest that we divide up water in the basin. We found that it's pretty close to the existing agreement on water. And then we also dug into the agreements on water in this basin, what I might like to call, coming from our experience in the United States, the law of the river for the Orontes, because in the Orontes you don't find one treaty. You find a progression, a buildup of various documents which now govern what is perceived to be the law in the basin. And so in 2001, there was the sort of culminating agreement here, which brought things into line with what the countries thought should be the agreeable framework, and also it's in agreement mostly with the UN 1997 Convention on Transboundary Watercourses. The articles shown here are the ones that deal with arbitration. When you have an argument or a dispute that can't be settled, what should you do? So both of these are in good agreement. And just to show what was this culmination of the negotiations in the basin, you can see the comparison here between what was the situation in 1994, which was not considered to be particularly fair to all parties, versus the modifications which came along in 2001, which then are perceived by the parties to be the win-win situation. It increased the allocation of water to Lebanon. It gave them the mandate to pursue construction of new infrastructure, as well as to increase the groundwater, which was being withdrawn within Lebanon and used within Lebanon. And also some hydropower considerations, and a committee, a binational committee, established. And so this definitely improved the situation for the hydrodiplomacy in the basin. There have been some conflicts over water in the basin, and this is a picture of a dam before, during construction in the time period of the Hezbollah-Israeli war, and it was perceived as a conflict article, was removed by conflict, and stands that way today. The basin of the Orontes has been identified through a UNESCO-supported project with Professor Aaron Wolf at Oregon State University, the so-called Basins at Risk project. You can't quite see it, but near where it says the Jordan River, just above that, you find one small basin, which is the Orontes Basin. And because of all of these factors, it was considered to be one of the basins at risk. Why? Well, you see in the basin unilateral developments of infrastructure in both Syria and Turkey. So consultation between the countries was not carried out prior to the construction of various projects there. You have large and rapid changes in the physical setting, with new irrigation systems coming online, new dam infrastructure, and things like that in all three of the riparian countries. You also have tensions not related to water. As George mentioned earlier, the Orontes Basin is sort of at the heart of what we're all rather nervous about going on in Syria and the borders with Turkey and Lebanon. So this is a non-water related conflict which is going on. And so you bring these three things together, and this has now been somewhat universally recognized as the risk factors for a basin. And so the Orontes, as we've mentioned, is the scene of major conflict. There has been major damage to infrastructure in Syria in recent months and years. There are daily clashes on the borders with the other riparian countries, and the conflict is not a waterborne conflict, but it's a political and military conflict. So this basin has many, many troubles. You can see here on the right, in the upper right, you can see the refugees moving from Syria into Lebanon across the Orontes, and some other recent aspects of the activities in this part of the world. The population from the Orontes Basin, there's a massive refugee displacement going on here. 3/4 of the inhabitants of the basin have been displaced as a result of the conflict. And they're, as was mentioned earlier, they're finding refuge in the neighboring countries, which is placing a huge burden on those countries. The access to water, you can see it here in the diagram. One of the things to notice is that the darker color there is the areas where you have very low access to water. Those are also the areas where you have the largest displacement of refugees. Access to drinking water is becoming a problem in this area. It's very critical. The access to electricity to run the pumps, which provide water, is also becoming a great problem. And so the situation there is not great. So to conclude our joint presentation here, just to remind you that we found that the GIS tools are very helpful in terms of determining the areas of the riparian countries in the basins, satellite information in order to provide some unbiased information that does not come necessarily from one country or another country, but can be generally agreed to. We find that the UN Convention, 1997, as well as 1992 UNECE Convention, provide good frameworks from which the countries can establish some negotiating positions and be able to understand the general obligations of international water law. Hydrodiplomacy is seen to be one of the most common ways that agreement over of transboundary basins can be reached, and that this is definitely something which provides benefits to the riparians in the basin. One of the difficulties that's going to be faced in this area is that the agreements which have been reached have been between the Lebanese and the Syrian government. The Turkey has generally been a silent partner to this. When the situation in Syria becomes more stable one way or the other, there will probably need to be a revisiting of this. And so that will be seen in the future. And definitely there will be a major impact on the institutions of water management in the region as stability hopefully is reached in the not too far distant future, we would hope. So with that, we'd be glad to take any of your questions.
Merci beaucoup. Peut-être... Merci.